The webinar is now live. Okay. Okay, we're going to wait a minute, but make sure everybody has a chance to sign on. Welcome to our fall 2020 report. We're very excited to be presenting. We have a situation where we would normally present at a breakfast meeting, which is very nice. Last year we were at Century World and we had a great breakfast meeting. We normally do that on a biannual basis, but certainly COVID is preventing that from happening. So we're doing then sort of the next best thing in having this webinar. In addition, given the uncertain nature of things and given the very positive news about vaccines, we're hoping to certainly come back next December and have a in-person breakfast. So, if we all cross our fingers and so forth, we should be able to do that. But our next meeting will be in May. That will be for our spring report. We won't be able to do that. We're also going to be doing a webinar as well. So for today, we have two very good presentations. Our first presentation is going to be by Kevin Bahr, who's the Chief Analyst here at Center for Business and Economic Insight. He'll be talking about the significant challenges, economic challenges that America is facing in 2021, and how the political and economic divisions and social divisions that we face also will make things a little bit more difficult than they may otherwise would be. In terms of this presentation, he will be focusing on two topics. He'll look at the continued effects of COVID-19, and he will also be looking at the rapid growth of budget deficits and public debt. In addition to that, Kevin has a blog, and in that blog, he will be addressing some other issues and challenges that we're going to be facing in 2020 and 2021 as well. You can find the blog on the CBEI website. In addition, everybody will be receiving a electronic version, a flipping book version of our written report, and we'll be sending that out to you, and you'll be able to get to the website address on the first page as well. So if you, in order to get to the blog posts. In addition to that, we will also be sending out to all of our attendees a copy, a recording, I should say, of this webinar too. Our second presentation is going to be presented by two UWSB faculty, Nick Butz and Reed Stratton, being assisted by two SBE students, Abby Schmidt and Emily Gruber, and they're going to be doing their own particular research on grit. In particular, the title of their presentation is "Grit Won't Quit: How Hiring for Passion and Perseverance May Help Reduce Turnover," and that will also be part of our special report in our written report as well. Just before we get started, essentially, first of all, is Kevin Bahr with us now? I just want to make sure. Not yet. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we will get started by having Nick, Reed, Emily, and Abby present first, and then we'll do Kevin Bahr's presentation second. Just before we kind of get started, with regard to questions that attendees have, please use the chat box. Given that it's the webinar nature, we're not face to face, it's going to be more difficult than having a normal question. So what I will be doing is monitoring our chat box, and then at the end we'll save 10 minutes for questions. Now I will be kind of consolidating questions if there's a lot of light questions and so forth. In addition, for those students who are attending for pro events, at the end of the event, we will be taking attendance, and I will give some more instructions at that particular time. So at this point, what I would like to do is introduce, but before I introduce Nick and Reed and our students, I also want to talk a little bit about our report in terms of our written report that you will be getting an electronic version of. There's things in addition to what we're presenting here in that report. Like always, we have an economic indicators section that will really kind of reveal some interesting data showing really the unique impacts of the pandemic. Also, we have Pflughoeft, who is our data analyst director, and for the director of the Center of Data Analytics here at UWSP, is going to present in our Insight Spotlight an article about data analytics. It's called Release the Data Analyst, that really discusses the value of data analytics for business. And we also will have a nice interview by our senior research assistant, Emma Fisher, who has interviewed Jade, Arnold, and Zach Strenger about their business. Their business is Lumens Productions, which is a local business here at Stevens Point. And Lumens makes marketing videos for its clients. And before we get started, I also want to kind of thank a number of people for which this presentation would not be possible. Certainly, Eva does fantastic work here in terms of both the publication and our website designer and in the blog as well. And certainly, thank you so much for all your efforts and for the webinar too. Emma Fisher, our senior research assistant, this would not be possible without her. She's done a heck of a lot of work this semester, and I very much appreciate everything that she's done. Kevin Bahr, who hopefully will be joining us shortly, he's our chief analyst and the blog master. He's just done a terrific job as well. And lastly, I just want to thank the School of Business and Economics for their support, both financial and otherwise as well. So without further ado, I think what I'm going to do is introduce our second presentation, but we had this, but will not be for first. And this is our Grit Won't Quit, How Hiring for Passion and Perseverance May Help Reduce Turnover. Just want to kind of just brief introductions of their presenters. Dr. Nick Butz is an assistant professor of business here at UWSP. He has his PhD and MBA from the University of North Dakota. He has research interests in technology use within organizational context and organizational design and innovation, and teaches multiple classes at the undergraduate and graduate level in data analytics and management information systems, and with regard to our MBA program. Then we have Reed Stratton. He's an assistant professor of business communication here at UWSP. He has his PhD from UW-Milwaukee in professional technical writing. His research interests includes business storytelling and improvisation in business presentation. He teaches our business communication classes at the undergrad level and at the MBA level. Assisting Nick and Reed are Abby Schmidt, who has a BS in accounting and business administration from UWSP. She's currently a graduate and research assistant for UWSP and is in our MBA program. And Emily Gruber is an accounting and finance major at UWSP and is also a research assistant as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand that off to Nick.
Actually, I'll be starting. Scott, thank you very much for the introduction, though. This is a great time to be an expert at business improvisation and presentations. So we're going to be going second, but we're happy to go first. I just want to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are, from your home or your offices or maybe a coffee shop watching this. There's an individual named Phil Holmes who worked at a coffee shop, and he enjoyed it. It was okay work, but he really wanted to own a bakery. So one day he quit. Now, Phil, though, he didn't quit with a 2-week notice or any kind of meeting with his supervisor. This was his approach to quitting that position.
Excuse me, everybody. Derek, Jake, everyone, I got an announcement to make, and I got my friends here to help me out. Guys, hit it.
I am quitting this job today. Hey, hey, hey. I'm leaving. Even though I like it here, wanna start a new career, gonna make it to the top and start my coffee shop. I am moving on. Got to go, got to go, got to go.
I think the best thing for this was that one of the comments was, could you imagine being fired that way? This is funny. We can laugh at it. It looks good on social media. But you guys all know as business practitioners that turnover is not nearly as pleasant or harmonious as this. There are real stakes and real costs involved with it. It weakens your foundation as a culture and weakens your foundation as an organization. And there's several costs. There's the intangible costs of turnover, which include things like all the innovation that leaves when an individual leaves. I mean, this person quitting the coffee shop quit by singing with a orchestra. He's going to take all his ideas and go and use it in his own bakery that he's going to start. So you lose the innovation. When people leave, you also lose clients, whether you're in a sales profession or not. Networking is so important, and your network goes with the individuals who leave. But also the people who are left behind struggle a bit. You start to see some wavering commitment when people are voluntarily quitting time after time after time. And you don't have the time to build the trust that everybody needs, whether it be from manager to direct reports or direct reports to manager. Distrust just starts to reign when you see this repeated situation of turning over. In addition to that, you have issues of hindered morale overall, just at scale, that more and more people who see things being turned over, the more they're likely to consider quitting themselves and maybe not feel so comfortable with their current position where they are. Additionally, there's also the financial costs of turnover. Now, it was determined by the Society for Human Resource Management that on average, to replace an individual who voluntarily quits takes about 42 days and around $4,000. You can imagine that time after time, this really adds up to be a big issue. And in matter of fact, it was predicted in 2019 that in 2020, 47 million workers would voluntarily turn over. That's about a third of the workforce. And that's from Society for Human Resource Management. And again, this prediction came out before COVID, so maybe things have gotten even worse with voluntary turnover. So it's a real issue. And Nick and I, for a while, have studied this concept of grit, which Abby will tell you about in a little bit. But we're so fascinated by this idea of maybe there's organizations who hire for this trait of grit. And if they do, they see lower turnover than organizations who don't hire for grit. And so that was really the main question driving the research for this. And I'm going to turn it over now to Abby Schmidt, who's going to elaborate a little bit on grit and the concept of it, where it comes from.
Thanks, Reed. So you've probably heard the term grit before, but to define it specifically, what we're looking at, grit is the combination of passion and perseverance toward long-term goals, meaning that people have consistent interest in the same goals for a long period of time, and they put forth effort over time consistently towards those goals as well. So you can go to the next slide. So we were interested in finding out what kind of previous research had been done on grit and retention. Grit is often studied in the context of success in a variety of different arenas, as in high school or business or just various disciplines. But as far as its connection to retention, the research is somewhat limited. And the research crosses disciplines, which we wanted to fill that gap, and we wanted to focus on how grit could improve retention in the business setting in a variety of industries. So one of the prominent articles that we found that does connect grit to retention is called the grit effect. It studied whether grittier soldiers, sales professionals, high school students, and married men would have higher retention or would turn over less in each of their respective disciplines. And what they found was that even when controlling for common variables within each context, those who had higher grit levels, who were 1 standard deviation higher in grit, were much more likely to be retained. 40% more likely in the sales profession, which has a lot of turnover, 21% more likely to graduate from high school in a certain school district. So overall, this article found that grit does indeed predict a good amount of turnover. The second article is called True Grit. This one studied how grit could predict retention in novice teachers in low-income school districts, which in the teaching profession in general, but especially in low-income school districts, turnover tends to be very high. And what they found was, at least in the first study, that those who were higher in grit were more than twice as likely to be retained as those who were not as high in grit. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, and we're going to talk a little bit about the research process that we did to contribute to this literature.
All right, thank you, Abby. Yep, I'm going to talk about the research process and how we went about this study. Next slide, thank you. So this slide breaks down the design of our research process, our sample, and the questions that we asked. So how we went about it is we conducted a longitudinal study that encompassed a survey at time 1 and a survey at time 2. And these surveys were sent out through the business councils of Portage, Marathon, and Wood County. In 2018, when we sent out our first survey, we received 100 responses. And of those 100 responses, 52 also responded in 2019. On the survey, we asked a variety of questions. In 2018, we asked for respondents to put down the number of hires that they had in their business for that year. And then when they responded again in 2019, we asked them to put down the number of quits that they had within that year. So by collecting this data, we were able to calculate the turnover rate for the business, which is the number of quits that they had in 2019 divided by the number of hires that they had in 2018, multiplied by 100. We also asked a variety of questions that related to the grit scale. Those questions being about grit effort and grit interest. An example of a question about grit effort would be, how do you overcome setbacks? And an example of a question about grit interest would be, how do you maintain focus and are you not easily distracted? We also asked questions of solving skills as well as teamwork. All right, and also on the survey, we asked for the respondents to put down their specific NAICS code, which identifies the industry that their business belongs to. So by gathering this information, I was able to create this tree map that you see here, which is the breakdown and visualizes our sample size and the industries within that sample. So we broke it up into 2 sectors. It was the goods sector and the services sector. Goods accounted for 21% of our sample, and services accounted for 66% of our sample, and then 13% was other or unspecified. So within the goods sector, our largest participant in the sample was from the manufacturing industry at 73%, and the largest sample came from, for the services sector, came from the insurance and finance industry, as well as the health industry, both at 10%. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Butz, and he's going to talk about our findings.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate the introduction here. All right, so next slide, I'd like to get things started. So in order to look at the results, we did a number of statistical analyses, but I wanted to share with you kind of the visualizations because I thought that would maybe better illustrate what we found. So the first question is there actually something going on here? It made sense intuitively that companies that hired grittier candidates maybe saw less turnover, but we thought we better, double check if there was a pattern. So we standardized grit and turnover in terms of Z-scores and plotted them in terms of a column chart, just to group them by industry and see if there was a pattern. And of course, it didn't pan out for all of them, but as you see in a number of them, we kind of saw exactly what we were hoping to find. So for example, in the arts and entertainment industry, we see a lot of turnover represented by the blue column, but also the grittiness of those entry-level candidates was low. Then conversely, another example from the other side, the food and entertainment industry, food and hospitality industry, you see that we actually have really high grit in terms of the folks that work in that industry, but then very low turnover. So, so this kind of gave us confidence to further pursue these relationships. Next slide, please. All right, so in order to better quantify them, we created a scatter plot with putting grit on the y-axis and then also retention on the x-axis. And I want to make a quick point here that we used retention, which is really just the inverse of turnover. So if you're thinking of turnover as people leaving, retention then of course is the people that are staying. The reason we did that is because we wanted, a nice positive slope when there was that relationship we were looking for. It's 2020. We don't want to see any negative slopes. We've got enough of that happening naturally, right? So we're looking for that nice positive slope. The first thing we did is check to see if grit combined had a relationship with retention. So kind of the best fit line between those actually had a slope that looked basically like a flat line. And if you're in the healthcare industry, right, flat line is never a good thing. So we thought we better look a little bit closer and we split it out into those two subcomponents that Emily introduced on our survey here. We have interest, which you can see that on the middle scatter plot on the right side. This also didn't seem to be very indicative of anything. If anything, the slope almost appeared slightly negative, which didn't make a lot of sense. But when we moved on to the final scatter plot, the bottom one, we found what we were anticipating and hoping for, and that was a positive slope on that best fit line between retention and grit effort. So basically, if you think rise over run, the more effort they experience, the higher the retention is as well. So kind of a unit for unit increase there. Not exactly one-to-one, but you understand the relationship. Next slide, please. All right, so to calculate the association or the degree of association between these, we just did a simple correlation analysis to start off with. So if you need a little refresher on correlation tables and how those look, we've got variables listed down column 1, and they're also numbered. Then we've got our columns listed from left to right, and those are also numbered. And then where those numbers match up, essentially is the degree of association between those two variables. So if you match variable 1 with variable 1, it's a dash because it's a perfect 1. You're looking at the same thing twice. It's a little bit like playing Battleship, which may be why I like it. I want to guide you through just a few of them. We want to take a look at that relationship I mentioned just at the end of the previous slide. So if you look at variable 10, it's got a kind of a gold oval around it. It's our turnover rate, really our main research variable of interest, and its relationship to grit effort, which was variable 7. If you notice the green line connects to that relationship there. So now we've got an association or a correlation coefficient, negative 0.41, which was statistically significant. This is a negative coefficient because now we're using turnover instead of retention, but that's exactly what we thought. So the grittier you are in terms of grit effort, the lower the turnover is what we expected there. Some other ones kind of interest on this slide is also the blue ovals. So we know now that grit effort's important. So what causes grit effort if we can take that one step back? And there was a kind of a great relationship between problem solving skills and grit effort. So those two seem to move together as well, 0.36 in that blue oval. Lastly, we were also looking at some other variables. Oh, thanks. We were also looking at some other variables that related to turnover. Another one that emerged as being statistically significant was the relationship between company age in turnover rate, which was also negative. So that means the older companies get, it seems like they're reporting less turnover. So maybe after being in business for a while, they figure out a little bit more on how to keep people around, or maybe just because new companies, you know, have a lot of tumultuous times at the beginning, so they don't keep people around as much. So that was another interesting relationship that was kind of an unexpected but neat finding. All right, next slide, please. All right, now I want to move into our regression analysis, and this is the last one that I'll be talking about with you today. But really, this is kind of, I would say, the crown jewel of what we have to show you this morning, and I think it's really, really impressive. So we did multi-step hierarchical regression here. Essentially, we're looking for the predictive value between our variables. And what was really neat about our data set is we had longitudinal data. So we could actually look at something in 2018 and then the predictive value of it in the 2019. So just to kind of start you off at the top of the table, R squared is kind of the amount of variability explained by the model in general. So if you take a look in step 1 of our regression, we took at interest and effort and combined that model explained about 17% of the variability that we see in turnover, which doesn't seem like maybe a lot, but it's so much going into it that it actually is pretty significant. And if you look at the individual predictors, grit effort, again, you see that negative 0.41, which you've seen before, was a significant, the strongest individual significant predictor. So now looking at step 2, we decided to control for a few other standard hiring criteria that employers look at. So whether they're looking for problem solving skills and teamwork. And what was really interesting is that even after adding those to our regression model, controlling for them, we still had a significant R squared value, and it even went up a little bit. And grit effort also remained a significant predictor. That means that problem solving skills and teamwork, they're not robbing grit effort of its predictive ability. There's something distinct and new that is adding to our understanding of that. All right, now I'm going to turn it back over to Reed, next slide, to talk a little bit about our implications.
Thank you very much, Nick. So what we always like to ask is, so what does this mean for your business? What's the next step for you? So I'll talk a little bit about some advice that we can give you based on these really rich findings that Nick talked about. So first off, as we predicted and hoped, we have seen that companies that hire for grit combined, which is passion plus perseverance, see a 42% decrease in turnover compared to average companies that do not favor those as much. Additionally, turnover can be hard to get a hold of. There's a lot of variables to it, but if you can predict 17% of turnover variability by hiring for grit combined, that's a pretty significant move that you might make. Now, it doesn't cost a lot of money or time to integrate grit as a hiring criteria. It's just a matter of posing certain research or interview questions and also changing the way that the job posting is written, making some adjustments on that. A couple other strategies for that would be administering the grit scale. We had used this in a little bit of other research that we've done. It's a 12-question assessment that will help you rank the grittiness of applicants. You can also incorporate grit-based behavioral interview questions. So we all know that behavioral interview questions prove to be pretty effective. If you could pose some grit-based ones, such as tell me about a time that you overcame obstacles to accomplish something that was important to you, that might be a really nice way to test that grit combined in the interview process. Also in an interview, consider running an applicant through a scenario, perhaps a real scenario that happened in your organization that was a problem, and asking them to try to solve that problem or talk through how they would resolve that. What you can do then is you can attune to the language that they use, both in the way they talk about that scenario and in their interview responses, and watch for signals of attitudes about obstacles. If they talk about obstacles as opportunities or challenges, for example, you might have a pretty high grit applicant, and then you can take that assumption and you can compare it with what you determine from the grit scale, and that will help you to really separate out who the high grit candidates are. We also notice a difference in companies that have been around for a long time. They've done pretty well with turnover compared to newly established companies. But we would encourage those companies to continue to isolate for grit effort specifically as one of the sub-factors of grit, because we saw the turnover rate fall by 0.41 units for companies that chose to hire for grit effort, who've been around for a long time. Now, the nice thing too about the grit scale is that you can isolate certain responses. So like if you want to figure out the effort-based responses, that's 7 through 12. So of course you can use the grit scale to determine grit combined, but then if you want to zoom in on who has the highest grit effort, look at the answers specifically to 7 through 12. Newer companies, especially startups, we would encourage you to try isolating for grit interest. And the reason for this is that it's especially important to try to reduce turnover for new companies, because Nick indicated that there was such a higher turnover rate with new companies. And that grit indicates to us that interest or passion tends to hold and push through structural changes. So when you have a new organization, there's going to be changes in management, changes in policy, changes in culture. And if you have high grit interest candidates and employees, they tend to push through that change better. They also tend to do a little bit better in high stress environments because they are motivated by a sense of meaning that's a little bit deeper than just making money, but also like achieving their passions and pursuing their passions. So how might you do this as a new company? I would encourage you to use the language of why. Many of you are probably familiar with Simon Sinek, who has the video of Start with Why. If you can indicate why on your job postings and on your organization's web pages, and you can get people talking about why rather than just what, so explain to them why your company does what it does rather than just what it does, that tends to really resonate with people who are at the high grit interest component. You can also isolate on the grit scale by looking at the responses of items 1 through 6, because those are the grit interest items. And that can help you to determine higher grit interest candidates that might work better for your newer organization. So whether you're a new organization or an older organization, overall turnover wreaks havoc on the foundation of your business. And we encourage you to take small steps in integrating hiring for grit. It doesn't have to be a major change, but I think that you'll find a lot of results with it, and that you'll start to slowly patch up some of those holes that have been built into or that have been created in the foundation that have been caused by turnover. We want to thank you very much for your attention today, and we are happy, I believe, to answer questions. Although, Scott, would you like to go to Kevin, or would you like us to answer questions?
Thank you so much, Nick and Reed and Emily and Abby. That's what a terrific line of research that you developed, and very useful. At this point, I think what we're going to do is we're going to go to Kevin for his presentation, and then we're going to save questions at the end. So I just want to remind our attendees, please offer your questions in the chat box. I haven't really seen any so far yet. But please, and we'll be able to allocate, say, the last 5 to 10 minutes for those questions. So, Kevin, I thank you. I'm glad you're able to make it, and I think that was my mistake, so I apologize. But I want to kind of introduce Kevin Bahr. He's the Chief Analyst for the Center for Business and Economic Insight. He's been with the School of Business and Economics since 1999. He has his PhD as well as a master's in economics and in accounting, all from UW Milwaukee. Has 10 years experience working at Robert Barrett & Company. He was the VP of corporate finance there and a security analyst as well. His research interests are personal finance, corporate finance, and financial markets. And he teaches finance classes both at the undergrad level and for our MBA program. So Kevin, without further ado, I'm glad you can make it.
All right, thanks a lot, Scott. Well, you can never have too many Zoom meetings. Actually, you can, which is why we are very happy that you have joined us this morning. So thanks for everybody thanks go out to everybody for tuning in this morning. All right, what I'm going to talk about this morning is a little bit the divisiveness that's going on in the United States, give you a little bit of a historical background when maybe politically it wasn't so bad and things actually got done, and then kind of tie that into what could possibly happen, the challenges that we currently face in 2021. All right, so in terms of what America can do, this is just kind of a very small sample of some of the ways that Republicans and Democrats and independents came together to make some very significant legislation or accomplish some very significant things for the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, obviously a very contentious period in American history. And that definitely required Republicans and Democrats to come together and obviously pass some very important legislation to at least provide a start to preventing discrimination. The 1969 moon landing, that also was a joint effort. It would have never happened if Republicans and Democrats would not have come together. The 1983 Social Security reform is rather significant because what was going on in 1983 is similar to what is currently going on today. The trust fund was heading toward a deficit in 1983. The retirement trust fund for Social Security was heading toward a deficit by the year 2034 before the impact of COVID. So it's going to happen a lot quicker if nothing happens. In 1983, and that was the solution under Reagan, the Democrats, the Republicans, they expanded benefits, but then also increased the withholding tax, basically Social Security taxes. It's kind of hard to believe it took until 1990, but they finally got it done. Illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. So again, Republicans and Democrats wouldn't have happened if the two didn't come together. And then finally, the 2010 tax deal, the Bush tax cuts of 2003 would have expired at the end of 2010 unless Congress did something, and they basically extended those tax cuts with one change. That was increasing the top tax rate in the top tax bracket. I mean, the bottom line is things can be accomplished, but it's a lot easier to accomplish things if you can kind of have everybody moving toward accomplishing something. All right, so where we are currently, obviously, it's COVID-19. It's all about COVID-19. And I'll give you some a little bit of a history coming up here in terms of how the United States economy acts. But pretty much, if you can get the economy going in the right direction, it continues to go in the right direction until you hit sort of like a bump in the road, kind of an economic bump or an economic shock. And a big reason for the economy continuing to move in the right direction, once you get it going in the right direction, it's consumer spending. It comprises 2/3 of GDP. In other words, 2/3 of economic growth. So as the US economy expands, more people get employed, more people spend money, so the economy continues to expand. So it's kind of like a snowball going downhill. Kind of the reverse is also true. If you get an economic bumper shock, less people spend money, unemployment goes up. That means more people are going to be unemployed. So again, there's going to be a cutback in consumer spending again. So it kind of goes both ways. This gives you a little bit of the economic history in the United States, and this pretty much demonstrates that for the most part, the United States economy does just fine once you get it going in the right direction. 27 out of the last 30 years, we have had economic growth in the United States. You can see the little red numbers there in 1991, 2008, 2009. We had some hiccups that I'll talk about. Also, 2001, the annual growth was positive, but 2001, we had a couple of quarters of negative economic growth. So it was kind of a minor bump, and I'll talk about that. The big economic growth for the United States, that was actually back in the 1990s. That's highlighted in yellow, and a lot of that is related to technology. Basically 94, 97, 98, 2000, I mean, all that is pretty much related to the growth of the internet. Over the last decade, the best year of economic growth, it was 2015 at 3.1%. When I say economic growth, it's basically the value of goods and services that are produced in the United States in a given time period, in this case annually. The tax cuts of 2018 contributed to a kick up in economic growth in 2018, but it also had some other consequences that we'll talk about in just a couple of seconds. All right, so when it comes to these economic bumps and overall economic growth and kind of the challenges, it's pretty much when the United States economy is struggling, that's when the US government, which would consist of Congress, the president, and the Federal Reserve, that's when they need to step in and do something. So when things aren't going very good, you need to do something to get that economy going in the right way, to kind of get that snowball going down the hill. When things are going good, that's when you really need to be sort of financially prudent, so that when things eventually go bad, and they will, you just don't know when, you just don't know what's going to cause it. But when things do go bad, you can financially respond to the things going bad. To give you an idea of some of these economic bumps and how they sort of, it's pretty hard to foresee some of these things, but back in 1991, a little bit of an economic bump. Rate of inflation hit 5%. Going back to the Gulf War, oil prices more than doubled with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So as a result of oil prices going up, inflation going up, it's kind of hard to believe with our near 0% interest rates today. But the Federal Reserve largely influences, pretty much controls interest rates in the United States. And the short-term rates stood at 8% in July of 1990, which is almost unthinkable today. So the resolution, inflation, oil prices eventually came down. The Federal Reserve is very important in getting the economy back on track in every one of the instances that I'm going to be talking about. The Federal Reserve lowered rates from 8% in 1990 down to only 3% in 1992. And then the kick in of the rise of internet and technology companies, typically referred to as the dot-com boom. And that pretty much carried the decade of the 1990s. The next economic bump that we had was 2001. Again, the entire year we did have economic growth, but you had 2 quarters of negative growth. And again, as far as the causes, kind of a myriad of things contributed to an economic slowdown. The dot-com bubble, what goes up must come down. Technology was very strong. Unfortunately, not every company that was involved with technology, not every company that was involved with the internet in the 1990s turned out to be profitable and successful. So the NASDAQ, which is largely a technology stock index that declines over 75% in roughly about a 2-year period. So obviously that's going to negatively impact consumer spending if your portfolio goes down by 75%. The terrorist attacks of 2001, that basically ground the US economy to a halt. You have fear, you have uncertainty. People typically don't go out, they don't spend. You certainly didn't feel like flying after September 11. So that had a negative impact on the economy. In addition to that, Enron was kind of the poster child for releasing fraudulent financial statements. And so that's going to have a negative impact on the stock market, because you start wondering, well, if a company releases its earnings, are they credible or are they not credible? So you had kind of a myriad of things going on in 2001. The resolution after the economy slowed down, the tax cuts of 2003, very similar to what they did in 2018, except in 2003, taxes were cut when the economy was struggling. In 2018, taxes were cut when the economy was growing. In addition to that, the Federal Reserve once again hammers interest rates. They reduced interest rates 10 times 10 times in 2001 down to a low of 1.75%. And then, of course, the financial crisis, 2007 to 2009, a bunch of different things kind of went into this one, so I'll try to make this brief. But in the 1980s, you really kind of had the growth of mortgage-backed securities. And what mortgage-backed securities were, banks could turn around and sell their mortgages, their loans, to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, government-sponsored organizations, and Wall Street firms. Why would they do that? Well, because when Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Wall Street firms bought the mortgages, it pumped more money into the system, so it helped the housing market. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Wall Street firms could turn around and bundle these mortgages and sell mortgage-backed securities to investors. So in essence, if you bought a mortgage-backed security, you were investing in a pool of mortgages. So the good thing, it created liquidity in the mortgage market. You put more money in the mortgage market, but it also allowed a transfer of risk from the lenders, because, okay, I'm making a loan, but I'm getting rid of the loan. So perhaps there will be, or there could be, and there was, a lessening in the due diligence of those lending standards. And by the mid-2000 mid 2000s, there's just really an explosion of subprime loans, which are very risky loans. And if you had subprime loans and then you turn those loans into eventually mortgage-backed securities, some problems could be created. Well, one of the things that began to happen after the economy rebounded from the 2001 recession, interest rates start going up, because typically when the economy is going well, interest rates start to tick up. The Federal Reserve is trying to monitor and watch and balance inflation with economic growth. So rates went from 1% to 5.25% between 2003 and 6. Okay, well, what's the impact on the economy if that happens? Well, one of the big things is basically adjustable rate mortgages. Adjustable rate mortgages became very popular. Well, if you have adjustable rate mortgages, interest rates go up, well, your monthly mortgage payment is going to go up. That can be particularly problematic if it was a subprime loan, or basically a fairly risky loan to begin with. Interest rates go up. Higher monthly mortgage payment for homeowners. They can't make the monthly mortgage payment. What happens? You have a lot of homes get put up for sale, and it's kind of basic economics. If supply exceeds demand, home prices are going to fall, and that's what they basically did in 2008, depending upon your market, anywhere from about 15 to about 50%, depending upon what housing market you were in the United States. So the resolution to all this, I mean, you had a lot of stuff going on back in 2008. I mean, you had the housing market, that tanked. The S&P 500 went down by about 60%, and unemployment's going up. So it was a multifaceted problem. So once again, you have a combination of the United States Congress, President stepping in and doing something, and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve cuts the Fed funds rate 7 times. You get to a historic low of 0 to 0.25%, rock bottom. $800 billion stimulus package was passed. Temporary reduction in Social Security withholding taxes for 2 years from 6.2% to 4.2%. The overall idea, trying to get money into the hands of people quickly, and you were definitely aiming to get it into sort of lower and middle income taxpayers. There's a cap on Social Security taxes. Back in 2011, 2012, that cap was about $110,000. So if you were making $110,000, or I should say, any money that you made above $110,000, you weren't paying Social Security taxes on it. But any money below $110,000, you were paying Social Security taxes on it. You got a tax break. The result of what kind of the combination of those factors, longest period of economic growth in history. And then, of course, you get COVID-19 coming along, and COVID-19 featured the decline, of course, in consumer spending. If you're not comfortable going out, eating at a restaurant, you're not traveling, you're not comfortable going to a retail store, that's consumer spending. COVID-19 was going to cut back consumer spending, whether the economy was closed down, whether the economy was closed up, people have to feel comfortable in going out. Eating, spending their money, traveling, going to retail establishments. So the big thing in 2020, I might be saying the obvious here, but the big thing is getting the virus under control. When Americans once again feel safe shopping, traveling, and spending at retail businesses, the economy will bounce back. And again, historically, 27 out of the last 30 years, you've had economic growth in the country. Once you get the economic growth coming back, it will continue until the next economic shock or the next economic bump. And what the government's got to do is, and the Federal Reserve has already stepped in. Once again, interest rates are rock bottom low in the United States, close to 0. The government stepped in once with a stimulus package. Of course, there's debates in terms of how much should be spent with the next stimulus package, how it should be done. But this is the time the government needs to spend money because people are hurting. And if you look at industries that got hit, like the restaurant business, there's a lot of people in the restaurant industry that aren't making that much to begin with. So when that business is hurt and those employees are hurt, those are the people that need to be helped. This is the time that the government needs to do something. In terms of the debt and kind of how that's gone, I don't really even have to say too much in terms of these slides because the slides are going to kind of say it all. I will say a few things that in terms of budget deficits, and that's what you're looking at right now. This goes all the way back to 1940. Well, we didn't really have too much in the way of deficits until the 1980s, but this is kind of how you'd like to see kind of that deficit trend work. Okay, the 1980s, we had a severe recession, early 1980s, so the deficit grows, but then in the 1990s, the economy really comes back. You had the growth in technology. Well, the deficit actually turns into a budget surplus by the end of the century. Then in 2001, we got a little economic bump. Anywhere you see those little shaded bars on that slide, that's an economic recession. So you got an economic recession in 2001. Once again, the budget deficit goes down. You get the economic stimulus, both from the fiscal side, that's government spending, and the monetary side, that's the Federal Reserve, and the deficit starts to go down. Then you got the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and things really go bad for the US economy. But with the recovery starting in 2009, the deficit is reduced. However, in 2018, with the tax cuts, the budget deficit once again starts to grow. And that gets to be one of the problems. If you grow a deficit when economic times are good, that's not particularly good. It'd be like, from an individual standpoint, if you have quite a bit of debt and you're maxing out your income and you can't pay that debt down and you're going to take on even more debt. Well, if you can't pay down the debt at all when things are going really good, what's going to happen when things are going bad? Because things will go bad at some point in time. So that's the federal budget in terms of the raw numbers. This is federal debt as a percentage of US GDP. And sometimes federal debt is put in this manner because it's sort of like federal debt as a percentage of GDP is also federal debt as a percentage of US income. So this is kind of measuring, all right, do you have too much of a debt or not? Well, if you have $10,000 of debt personally, is that a lot? Well, if your income is $1,000 a year, yeah, that's a lot. If your income is $1 million a year, well, that isn't too much. Well, this is as a percent basically of US income. And what this is saying is, yeah, the numbers starts to get high. So once again, the United States coming out of those 2018 tax cuts starts to get in a very challenging position if things start going bad. And whether you're looking at it, that is a percentage of GDP, or the last slide, the raw numbers. This is the total public debt outstanding. Once again, you see the spike in 2020. No matter how you slice it and dice it, the United States has a lot of debt outstanding. So the challenge number 2 here is going to be, okay, what do you do down the road with this? Can Congress, President actually get together and do something about this? In September, the Congressional Budget Office, this is kind of a nonpartisan working group, if you will, for the United States Congress. They're supposed to look at what's going on in the economy. They're supposed to analyze different policy issues and then report back to Congress in terms of, hey, how are things going? What might need to change? So they do a long-term budget outlook for the United States. And again, this was just done in September. They include the impact of COVID. They also say that, okay, we're not going to change any of the way tax revenues are collected or any government spending, which then means that in terms of the recent tax cuts, the corporate tax rate, the statutory rate, it doesn't mean all companies pay this rate because they don't, but the statutory rate was lowered from 35% to 21%. That'll stay in place. Individual tax rates will revert to their 2017 levels in 2025 because there is a sunset provision and they will not be extended unless Congress acts. This is very similar to the Bush tax cuts of 2003. Congress did act in 2010. But this assumes that, hey, okay, we're not going to change what's in place. We're just going to do a little analysis and assume that individual tax rates will go up. And of course, if you're a politician running for office in 2024 and you're going to say, yeah, we'll just let the individual tax rates go up in 2025, good luck to you. The spending for Medicare and Social Security, that continues as scheduled even after trust funds are exhausted. And again, similar to what was going on in '83, the retirement fund will be exhausted. Right now, the United States is spending more in Social Security expenditures than what they're taking in through withholding taxes. 2020 was the year that turned around, and it turned around big time. Again, that retirement fund was going to be exhausted by 2034 before COVID. Now with COVID, it's going to be ramped up significantly. The disability trust fund, that's in fine shape. That's projected to be financially okay through 2065. But it is the retirement fund, that's the one that's going to get to be a little bit challenging. And that was the one that basically was challenging back in 1983. So in their analysis, well, it's probably not too surprising what they came up with. Deficits are going to be much higher than what they normally have been. Larger in every year going forward than the average deficit of 3% of GDP over the last 50 years. So the deficits are going to explode. A lot of that deficit is going to be kind of tied to what the United States government is going to end up having to pay in interest cost on its debt. The debt's going to go up. Projected budget deficits would boost federal deficit to 195% by 2050. That's not good. It's not fair to the next generation that they're going to have to deal with that if nothing is done. And the United States is already well on the way to reaching that figure. And spending. So when you look at this stuff, the idea is, all right, you've got a lot of debt. And so how are you going to solve this problem? And what should the government, what do the American people, what do they want the US government to spend money on? Should there be any change to healthcare? Is it okay that you can go bankrupt if you can't afford your healthcare costs? Because you come down with cancer. The majority of personal bankruptcy cases in the United States, it's tied to basically not being able to pay healthcare costs. Should every American have a right to healthcare in some fashion? Or if you're going to have those type of programs funded, then where does the money come from? Do you increase personal taxes? Do you increase corporate taxes? What do you do about Social Security? Yeah, that's going to be kind of an issue. Do you cut back spending? Social Security payments for retirees? Do you increase the withholding tax? Do you take money from income taxes to help fund Social Security? So the bottom line here is that there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of things that need to be decided because if the government does nothing, you don't get rid of the problem by doing nothing. You continue to kick it down the road, and at some point in time, you just can't kick it down the road anymore. It would have a major impact. And this is kind of the result. Bottom paragraph there, bottom bullet point, if you will. Federal debt to GDP level of 195% could put the United States economy in an extremely precarious position. And this is the CBO saying this. It's not my words, but I fully agree with them. Increasing borrowing costs, potential inflation, increased interest rates, even the possibility of a significant financial crisis. Because one of the things when the United States has a lot of debt outstanding, well, somebody has to buy it. And right now, by far and away, the two foreign investors in United States government debt, it's Japan and China. No other country is even close. So there's political impacts to that as well. If China decides, hey, we're not buying your debt anymore because we're not getting along with you, well, that's a problem because you're going to have to find someone else to buy that debt. And how do you find someone else to buy the debt? You make it more attractive and you keep jacking up the interest rate on it so somebody buys it. So the bottom line is lots of problems, lots of things that need to be done. Difficult challenges to meet prudently without political divisiveness, but with divisiveness, the challenges may not be met. And again, the problems aren't going away. The problems have to be dealt with. It's just a function of which generation is going to be dealing with the problem and how big the problem is when they have to deal with it. So I've talked about a couple of the challenges in our CBEI blog. We do have some more challenges talked about: manufacturing and trade, healthcare a little bit more, how U.S. Economic leadership has changed, and also what's happened to wages over about the last 40 years. So if you got some time and these issues are interesting to you, we encourage you to visit our CBEI blog for more information. And once again, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you everybody for listening. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I know we're running out of time here, but we do have a couple questions, and these are questions that come from Dylan Johnson. I think you addressed some of this issue somewhat, but he's asking about the debt problem going forward. When do you think you have to take care of this debt before before it becomes too much and too big of a problem? What are some things that can be done to address the debt? And how much do you think the stock market will jump when the vaccine goes public? So those are the two questions we have for you.
All right, I think I'll take the second question first. I think the stock market has pretty much priced in that vaccine working and things going pretty well. I mean, the S&P has been pretty strong this year. Technology stocks have been strong this year. I'm almost looking at it the other way. Things better go well with this vaccine and the rollout of it, because if it doesn't, I think you could see a significant market, if you want to call it, I guess the polite word is correction, but in other words, it's going to go down if this vaccine doesn't go the way that they hope that it goes, or the vaccine rollout doesn't go the way it goes. I mean, we've had a very rocky 2020 economically, but the market is up quite strongly. It's up over 10%, and it's like the market is kind of looking back what happened in 2020 with the expectation that things are going to get back to normal. And again, if this vaccine gets rolled out successfully and things work, things are going to, it's like a snowball. Things are going to go pretty good. And I think that's what the market has priced into it. So I think after this year, the market will continue to grow, not at a tremendous level, but kind of the average compounded return for the S&P 500, you go back over about the last 80 to 90 years, it's about 10%. I think the market will continue to grow pretty good, not great, but it would be on the flip side, if this doesn't go well, then you got a real problem. As far as how much debt is too much debt, that's always gets to be sort of a little bit of a kind of a subject of exactly how much is too much. But what you can say is that for the United States right now, you have to spend money right now when things are bad. So you're going to have to make decisions in terms of going forward. What programs are important, and those programs you can't exactly borrow to establish. So if you want to, whatever you want to do, if you want to expand the military, you want to expand the infrastructure, you want to expand healthcare, that money's going to have to come from something. And you want to try to balance your corporate tax revenues and your individual tax revenues such that when the economy is going good, that deficit's got to come down. And that was one of the problems in 2018. If you start getting up to the level that's projected by the Congressional Budget Office, 195% of debt to GDP, that is just a hell of a high number. That is way too high. You are burdening future generations way too much with that level of debt. And how do you get it down? Well, you got to make basically your tax revenues exceed your expenditures, and that's how you got to make it come down.
Okay, Kevin, well, thank you so much. And I do have a couple other questions, but unfortunately we just have run out of time. It's past the 9 o'clock hour here. And what I could do is for those couple questions, I can have Kevin email you on an individual basis. So I just want to thank everybody with regard to for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and want to thank our speakers, Kevin Bahr and Nick and Reed and Abby and Emily did a terrific job today. And again, Eva, I want to thank you for all your help as well. So one last thing is for those who are here for pro events, you can send a private message in chat to Professor Martin, include your name, ID number, and something you appreciated learning today. So otherwise, thank you, and it was great seeing everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.